Hey, all you cats and kittens, we're back on the Cinetopia podcast. And if you've seen the docuseries Tiger King, you know that line comes from the unforgettable Carol Baskin. This docuseries, directed by Eric Goode and Rebecca Chaikin, has received a lot of attention, particularly I think because it came out literally as most of the Western world who has access to Netflix came under lockdown. What is this film, or docuseries? It primarily follows the lives of American big cat owners, backyard zoos, cub petting businesses, and big cat sanctuaries. Most notably, a guy named Joseph Allen Maldonado Passage, otherwise known as Joe Exotic. He was previously the owner of GW Zoo in Oklahoma. And, it really deals with his longtime, very visible and vocal feud with Tampa-based cat sanctuary, and I say sanctuary in quotes, owner Carol Baskin, who at the first part of the series, docuseries, suggests he's in jail for an attempted murder on her. Other characters who make this docuseries even more interesting and rather creepy would be Doc Antle of the Myrtle Beach Safari, and Mario Tabreau, an alleged leader of a drug ring in the 80s in Miami, and also perhaps the inspiration behind the film Scarface. But there's also like many different characters who help run and Joe's operation as well. To me, is this show sensationalist entertainment? Absolutely. The film was sold to some of these characters in the series as being the blackfish for big cats. I think particularly Carol Baskin was quite upset about how she was portrayed, and I can imagine why. But personally, I didn't really like Blackfish, and so my argument is that it probably has brought more attention to this situation, focusing on the characters, who are owning these cats, by the fact that so many people have now seen it. I'm very curious, what you all think of this. So let's start with Betty, I guess. Betty, what do you think of the film?
So, I would say that I have mixed feelings about the series, but they're mixed in the sense that, like, they go in all kinds of extremes. In the sense that, like, I was extremely entertained by it, but I thought it was an incredibly fun watch. At the same time, it's ultimately a true crime show, which might just be my least favorite genre of television. I find true crime to be extremely ethically dubious, like, at the best of times, because a lot of true crime shows tend to, dramatize things and sensationalize them in a way that sort of makes these events, they turn these events into cheap TV, even though, like, the whole point of true crime is that it's, things that ostensibly actually happened, and yet these, true events end up being reframed into this sort of, like, corny TV show, which should be theoretically, like, exactly why you're, not watching, just a cheesy crime drama. But I feel like one thing that sort of redeems Tiger King in this sense is that, like, the filmmakers approached a bunch of protagonists that have already had decades, to sensationalize themselves and to narrativize their own lives. Because, in the case of Joe Exotic, he had a very long media presence already, and, like, his whole persona is sort of based around this idea of wanting to be famous more than anything, which means that, like, a lot of the sensationalist stuff from Tiger King, comes from Joe himself. This is stuff that he already made, like all of the footage, not all of the footage, but a good chunk of the footage was stuff that, he and his zoo had already taken themselves, with the express purpose of creating a narrative about his zoo that is crazy, that is insane, and that sort of pushes the boundaries of, the believable. Like, my personal, I don't know if you guys were at all familiar with Joe Exotic before this, but I remember watching a John Oliver show when Joe Exotic was featured as the Libertarian presidential candidate. And I remember thinking that was just, like, a weird cute aside for John Oliver's show, but, you know, the fact that now it's turned into this, like, you know, what is it, 7-episode saga about these feuds. Like, seeing that blow up in that way is just incredible to me, and I think, you know, just from even the most minimal exposure someone can have to Joe Exotic, you know that the show is the way it is because Joe's life is that way, or rather, like, he'd always wanted to present it that way, in a way. You know, even, you know, bits that aren't quite as favorable to him or to his character end up working out in his favor. You know, like, I read somewhere that, like, Donald Trump was asked if he would pardon Joe Exotic. So, you know, it has all the cynicism of any true crime show, but it's taken to such a comic extreme that, in a way, it makes it better.
Well, but I'd also say that's somewhat of the criticism, I think, given the fact, like, you have people like, you know, Donald Trump, who was asked whether he would be pardoned, and, you know, Cardi B, who's saying things like free Joe Exotic. And the truth of the matter is, you know, the guy did abuse animals for decades, and, you know, there's 17 counts of animal abuse. You know, it makes for good TV, but it's still a serious controversial problem. Carice, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could give the producer, the co-director and producer of this film, are we calling it a film?
Series.
Sorry.
Docuseries, you know.
Docuseries. Yeah, so I guess we could give the co-director and producer of this docuseries benefit of the doubt and say that they kind of set out to make something that was about exposing how ghastly the exotic pet industry is in the US, and they just kind of, you know, got thrown so much other material that it becomes, you know, so much bigger than that, and so kind of distracted from that. But I think, like, anyone who is going and meeting these characters, these people for the first time, would be able to tell immediately that this is, you know, this is going to go off in so many other directions. And like you say, you know, there have been other popular culture moments where Joe Exotic himself and a few other of the people in the docuseries have featured, so, you know, they're not completely unknown characters. I mean, I really liked it. I think I liked it as the larger than life entertainment that it is, and I also like it from a perspective where I can't watch it and see how it could be seen to glamorize or promote or enhance or encourage the exotic animal, big cat kind of pet ownership industry. But I'm aware that does come from a place where it would take a lot to convert me into thinking that was a kind of worthwhile industry.
You know, I actually read a Vanity Fair article that said that the director, Eric, who you see in the film, you know, doing a lot of the interviews, was actually wanting it to be much more of a blackfish conservationist film, and Netflix went back to him and saw the footage and said, no, we need to hand this up. We need to make it more about the people and the characters. I agree that it's, I mean, I personally find it entertaining. I'm from Florida, and I can't tell you, as someone who grew up in Florida, how many times, I mean, I actually think Gatorland is a quite hilarious, you know, theme park, which is also a sanctuary, if you will, in Kissimmee, Florida. But you drive up and down these highways, and you see these, you know, these billboards for these, like, backyard parks, and I don't think we ever got, you know, have ever had any interest in going there. So this is exposing me to my, you know, an understanding of a world that I'm, you know, I find is abhorrent. And so I think, based on the entertainment factor, I think, again, there are more people probably going to see this than another kind of environmental, you know, hard-hitting documentary. And that's, you know, so that's comes with pros and cons for sure. Jim, I'm just dying to hear what you think about this.
I fucking hated this to the depths of my bones. Since I've been doing this show, right, before this I had a reputation for kind of going off on rants about things, right, and I've tried to be measured and, calm and, talk about things. Honest to God, Tiger King just annoyed the absolute shit out of me from start to finish. It is interesting to hear, because I didn't know what you said about the fact that it was originally, or at least the director, the team behind it were aiming for more of a Blackfish type thing, and it was Netflix that actually kind of changed the focus. It doesn't particularly surprise me, because on a flight recently I watched another Netflix, it was a mini-series in this case, again true crime, called Don't F with Cats, right? And that annoyed me in exactly the same way. It's this... I felt horrendous watching it, right? I continue to watch it out of a sense of duty. I probably shouldn't have, because I'm just here to piss on everybody's parade right now. But it was centered on this guy who wants nothing more than to be famous, and we've given him 7 45-minute episodes of him being him. I mean, that's basically what it is. And I'm not terribly surprised that Carol Baskin isn't particularly happy with her portrayal in it, given that one entire episode is basically devoted to basically insinuating that she murdered her husband and put him into a meat grinder to be fed to tigers. So that kind of gives you the idea of the level of the show, quite frankly. And it seemed to be focusing on, really, and it was interesting. It was interesting that, Betty mentioned the fact that she was watching Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, right? Because as this show was going on, I kept looking at Joe Exotic and thinking to myself, where have I seen this guy before? I recognise this guy. And then in the show, they put up this clip from John Oliver's show, and I remembered, and that was it. That's where I recognised him from. And I remembered that segment. And to be honest with you, my interest, and in my opinion anyway, the interest in Joe Exotic as a person, right, which is what the majority of this show focuses on, my interest started and ended with that skit. He got about, 3 or 4 minutes. That's really about as much as I think he's worth. And after that, there's various things which made me a little uncomfortable. Like there's CCTV footage of one of Joe Exotic's husband's suicide, basically. And obviously you don't see the husband, but you see somebody reacting to it, and it felt a little bit gross and exploitative, and it did, in that respect, it did really remind me of that other miniseries, which went into, so Don't F with Cats went into this bit at the end about how, by watching this, are we glorifying it? And it made me quite angry, because the actions of the people inside the documentary were very different to that of watching it. It feels like it's aiming for this. It has this pretense of being about big cat exploitation, about this ownership of big cats in the United States. It is a passing thought, and it is done to give it this veneer of journalism, in my opinion. And apart from that, it's basically it's a walking meme factory. I realize I'm being a miserable git, but I didn't really get anything out of it in that respect, because that's all I found.
I would disagree that I think at the beginning and end of that film, it at least specifically has the titles up, which you would see with a classic environmental documentary, that describes the nature of the situation, which is massive. The fact that there are more big cats living in America than there are actually in the wild, and that you have people like Shaquille O'Neal or whatnot, who own them. I think it's actually, my question to you is, have you seen The Act of Killing? Because we have talked about that film being something that's a brilliant sort of film, and again, in the way that it's directed and all that stuff, it's arguably a brilliant film. But that's giving attention to perpetrators as well in this way that sort of, questions the morality of giving people, for vanity. I mean, in that sense, very much.
I agree. And that it is a tricky ethical one. I think the thing that I think the thing that I find with this is talking about, like, you know, the ownership of big cats in the States and who you're giving the focus to. Not only is this a little tricky ethically, but also, I mean, this is 7 episodes. I mean, like, the amount of material that has been wrung out of this guy is absolutely incredible. And when you think about the issue we're talking about and how long this series is and what it focuses on, there is a qualitative difference between that and talking about something like genocide over a shorter time period. Like, I think if this had been, you know, an hour and a half special, I might have actually had less of an issue with it, because the substance, or at least the substance to cookiness ratio would have been substantially different. But in this case, I mean, we've basically got whole swathes of this which are dedicated to Carol Baskin's husband disappearing. You've got another whole swathe of it that's dedicated to his run for Oklahoma. I mean, really, I mean, his run for, if we're talking about it, like raising awareness of any issues or educating people about it, I mean, you know, I mean, what do I care if he ran for Oklahoma governor? He pointedly, as far as I can remember, doesn't mention how many votes he got, because I mean, I would imagine he got absolutely sawed all. It's nothing more than a curio, but that is spun out into like an enormous amount of time, and it annoys me, this idea that it pretends it is doing some sort of noble thing when it's not. It's a caricature of this guy. It's designed to create memes. It's designed to have people dressing up as him at Halloween. Like, the very fact that Donald Trump got asked if he would pardon Joe Exotic, and, like, you know, you got people saying, you know, free Joe Exotic. Like, honestly, like, that shows you if what it says its goal was, it is not achieved. But I don't think that was its goal. I think its goal was to put across Joe Exotic, and it was basically the Netflix equivalent of a freak show, like, really. And it did not do it for me, because if that's all it's doing, then across 7 episodes, nah, no thank you.
So I just wanted to say that, you know, I did ultimately like this as a show in itself, but in terms of like the ethical aspect, I feel like there's not a character, you know, that's prominent in this show that doesn't claim that what they're doing is dedicated to big cat conservation. So, like, Joe himself talks about raising awareness and educating people and how that's what his zoo is all about, but obviously it isn't. And in a way, the show itself at times feels like it's kind of replicating that, in the sense that, like, it'll tack on you know, some statistics about, you know, how endangered tigers are at the very end. But up until that point, it was a show that had, you know, like cliffhangers and stuff, you know, and like other devices that just, you know, really upped the drama of the whole thing. Which, if it's, you know, ultimately the doing of Netflix rather than the filmmakers themselves, I think that's actually really interesting, because at that point, you know, you're kind of faced with the situation where you want to create a show that talks about an issue that's, you know, overlooked a lot of the time. You know, I certainly didn't know about this scene at all, even though, you know, after a while it feels kind of obvious, because you've seen wild cats in like a music video or something. I think everybody has. And only now do you realize where they probably come from. And, you know, in that respect, you know, that does sort of make you think about this stuff, you know, about animals being used as props, etc. But it's all packaged into this, like, um, you know, again, extremely cynical show that, you know, includes a lot of very questionable footage, as Jim pointed out. But at the same time, like, if you want people to actually watch the show, and you kind of, and you know, you want to make it into something that's gonna become as big as it did, um, you know, will you ultimately have to, you know, agree with these, well, from Amanda, what you said, from these like requests that Netflix made, you know, if you, do you have to agree with those things in order to make a show that's ultimately going to talk about something that you actually believe is like socially important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the I personally feel like if this was, with the amount of footage that they had, they were shooting for probably on and off, but for 5 years in total, I think was the sort of span of the film. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of footage that was incorporated in from um, people involved in the docuseries itself. I think if it had been any shorter, you'd have had a risk of kind of not fleshing out the full picture, because I felt when I was watching it that whilst many other things did progress as the 7 episodes went on, that one of the other things that happened was that a new character was introduced, often a character with their own park or with their own kind of enterprise or business that definitely kind of feeds into this kind of awful industry. And I think that was quite important in terms of like showing how massive the issue is, that it's not this kind of like one small locale in Florida. It's it's the Bhagavan guy who, and every new character comes with like multiple other kind of ghastly extras. Like, it's the big cat thing, but I think if you list out some of the themes that are involved in this, you've got there's cults, there's modern slavery, there's sexual exploitation. There's so much other stuff going on, and I feel like that builds to the rotten core that is the kind of exotic pet ownership. And those characters kind of keep getting introduced and keep showing how this is like a systemic issue and across the US, and it's not something that can be sort of turned a blind eye into. I'm kind of talking circles now. That this is a systemic issue across the US, and I also think that, like, similar to sort of what Betty was saying about it being the entertainment of it does bring in that massive audience. Like, I found myself, like, both online and the occasional times that I'm leaving a house at the moment, like I was in Sainsbury's the other day and people were talking about Carol Baskin behind me, and it sends that ripple, and it's so infrequent now that you have that kind of like event television, that kind of sense of everyone's watching the same thing at the same time. And I think this series has really done that. And that is nice for one reason right now, because we all feel so disconnected that it's nice to feel that we are all connected around one shared kind of interest and hatred of these characters. But I also think that
disconnect me, just disconnect me. Disconnect me right now.
But also I think that you're right in that you do reach that audience by throwing in some little weird and wacky treats along the way.
Yeah. I mean, I was concerned about those animals the entire time, particularly because I think very at the beginning there was this conversation about the amount of money that one needs to take care of, and then the massive amount of animals they were in, and the idea that I've pretty much, been anti-zoo for, quite a long time. So my concern was always when you're having these like abuse issues of, or loss of money, or seeing the way that Joe Exotic was treating, abusing the people who worked with him. In the back of my head, I was always going back to the fact that there was a whole zoo of animals that were probably not being treated well. I think that it is a psychological conversation about what happens when, and I think the end kind of emphasizes that. Where were people's original plans in this and getting involved? Was it the excitement of holding a big cat? And I just don't understand it. I don't understand, like, I know that there was this whole phenomenon, I don't know if it still exists, of like, guys with selfies of big cats and stuff, and I saw that like 6 years ago or something, and I was just like, why is that there? And what's the phenomena about this? But this, enlightened me to this world, and maybe perhaps what kind of person and what kind of excitement one gets, I guess, holding a cat that I would be too afraid to, because I wouldn't want to get my arm ripped off, So, but I do think, I guess my thing is that this blurs the lines of, it's okay that it blurs the lines of a documentary. It's entertainment. It's meant to be entertainment. I'm a big fan of reality television anyway, and I think there's a lot to be learned, like sociologically, about these kinds of shows of real people. Of course they're sensational, of course they're hamming it up for the camera, and of course they're not, like, there's some ethical issues in making films and exposing people and asking. For example, one of the husbands of Joe Exotic was told that he had to take his shirt off, and and supposedly not, he had teeth, but he was not allowed to be seen with teeth, and so we were exposing them in a certain way and light that we were sensationalizing the story even more, to emphasize, like, the fact that Joe and his camaraderie as meth heads and whatnot. I think it's okay sometimes if something's entertaining and not necessarily completely in the lines of a documentary true crime, like Errol Morris film, but that's just me.
I guess, like, one thing I would have liked to see them kind of maybe go into at some point in one of the episodes is just, like, the fix, like the solution. So, because I think that that's part of why we maybe come away from it and just think, like, or some of us have moments where we think this and some of us just think this entirely, that, like, well, that's all just kind of entertainment and exploitation, and there's no real kind of solution, because there's nothing that we can maybe engage with in terms of, like, well, how do you fix that massive gap in the numbers between the animals that exist in the wild and the animals that exist in captivity? And with those animals in captivity now, it's not as simple as, like, oh, well, we'll just, take them out of captivity. Like, we'll because the cycle has been created and it needs to sort of be stopped. And I would have been interested personally from just a personal point of view in terms of learning more about the issue and, like, what steps there are to kind of get out of this. And because I don't feel that Carol Baskin is a solution, and I know that people really, really hate her. I don't think I kind of hate her in quite the same sort of way that I'm that the a lot of the internet maybe does right now. And I have, read into her parks, and the animals do actually have, I think all of them or most of them have the right amount of roaming space for an animal in captivity, which is still not great. But she herself, her and Joe started from philosophically opposite points, where he kind of went into it on conservation and she went into it in breeding, and they sort of swap places, but I feel like they're still both as their self-interest is very much at the center of it, no matter what. So I think that could have done something to maybe sort of alleviate some of the kind of, like, ethical gripes that people have against the series, to just explore what actual solutions there are, and what, maybe some people who are actually doing, like, real good. Because, like, PETA's not even that. Like, we've all known for decades that PETA's a, corrupt and awful organization as well. But yeah.
Yes.
I think the closest that the show sort of gets to in terms of, like, proposing a solution is just government regulation, which is something that, Carol Baskin supports and that she's probably the major activist for, which I'm sure that, anybody who voted for Joe Exotic probably would disagree with, but it's about as close as you can go to, sort of stopping this industry in its tracks while still protecting the animals that are already held in captivity and were probably born in captivity and probably could not adapt to a life in the wild. So in that respect, I do think it at least offers that, but I think you're right in the sense that it doesn't, it doesn't talk about it in great deal, and I think the way Carol Baskin is portrayed, I think sort of attests to the fact that the way you film a certain event or person or whatever is going to probably affect the viewer's feelings, towards that person much more than anything that they're actually doing wrong. In the sense that, again, Carol Baskin is one of the main activists behind the only sort of viable solution to this, which is just regulate the market in that respect.
Yes, I agree, and I think there's ultimately an issue here on regulation, but the question is whether or not these sanctuaries, I suppose in her case, are any better. I mean, certainly it's better that she wants regulation and she's pushing for that, but I think a little bit of what's coming out is apart from the obvious possible killing of her husband, which is quite shocking.
I think that don't worry, you can all breathe easily. I'm not going to go on at length about it as much as I kind of want to, but to me though, for me that kind of gets to the bottom of why I didn't find it working for me. It raises quite a lot of things, including the likes of Carol Baskin's inverted commas sanctuaries, right? Are they actually any better? I don't think it really answers that. And not only does it not answer, I don't think it's really got much interest in answering.
I think it questions it, actually. I think that's exactly what it does.
But that's the thing. I think it does question it, but it questions it in the context of this ridiculous personal feud between the two of them. And that's the backdrop for it. And that's my whole thing with it. Everything in this is filtered through Joe Exotic and this, quite frankly, reprehensible character. I mean, the guy, and apparently he's a massive racist, and that was kind of the series and things like that. So that to me almost kind of gets to the heart of why I didn't feel good watching it, to be honest. As I say, I accept I am very much in the minority on this, both at large, and I think here as well, but to me, it's just the focus of this is all wrong, and I do think they could have maintained a little of the whole, sensationalist character stuff whilst being a little bit more substantive. But
so, if you have a personal enjoyment of Florida Oklahoma kitsch, and Twin Peaks likes characters, or you're like Jim, who really, really detests this with every bone in his body, it's up to you. It's on Netflix, and I'm sure you'll hear about it again.